Hi, I'm Crystal. Today we're going to do a couple of watercolor projects. You may have bought some watercolor products, whether that's paint, pencils, gel crayons, or markers, or maybe you bought the mixed media paper or the watercolor paper and you're not quite sure what to do with it, or maybe you feel like you don't have time to do something elaborate with watercolor. Well, today's projects are very quick and easy but high impact watercolor projects that anyone can do, and I hope it will encourage you to get out your watercolor products and use them. I mean, that's why we buy craft products, right? To use them. So I am going to do both of these projects with each of those 4 different types of products, so paint, markers, pencils, and gel crayons. So the first project, I'm using inexpensive watercolor paint. This project took about 2 minutes per product, and I'm starting out by putting a little puddle of clear water onto mixed media paper. You do want to use mixed media or watercolor paper because we are applying quite a bit of water to it, and that paper is sized, it's treated with some type of chemical or product on the surface of the paper, as well as incorporated when the paper is manufactured so that the water doesn't break the paper apart. So making that puddle of clear water gives the paint some place to go. So the paint's not going to escape where you've already put the water on the page as long as you drop it into the puddle of water. So I'm mixing a couple of colors because I think that's the beauty of water mediums. And that's all there is to the watercolor portion. So for the next product, I'm going to use some water-based markers. So these might be labeled as washable. Those are usually water-based. And I'm scribbling these down onto a piece of wax paper. You could also use a plastic bag or a piece of plastic packaging. That would work equally well. And I'm going to moisten the little scribble with a little bit of water from my Target spray bottle. And then I'm going to pick up that marker ink and I'm going to put it down into my puddle of water. Now this would also work if what you have is dye ink pads. You could smush the dye ink pad onto your piece of wax paper or plastic bag and it would work just the same way. So I'm picking up the pigment and dropping it into my puddle of water and blending it out so I have a nice artistic puddle, and just spreading out a little bit more color and using plain water as necessary. Now next I'm going to move on to the gel crayons. So these are sometimes marked as gel crayons, or it's very similar to the product called gelatos or distress crayons. These would need to go onto the paper dry, and then after they're applied to the paper we're going to spread the water across them to dissolve them. Now gel crayons will dry out, so you want to apply the water pretty quickly after you apply the crayon. You don't want to let that sit around for a couple of hours. But once we've spread it out with the water, we're ready to move on to the next product. And the next product is watercolor pencils. Now watercolor pencils, you can do your coloring and let that sit around for quite some time, days even. These are distress watercolor pencils, and I found them to be a little bit nicer than some of the generics I've tried in the past, but basically any watercolor pencil is going to work in a similar fashion. And once the pencil is down, I'm applying some plain water to blend out that color. And it would be difficult to apply the pencil to wet paper, so you want to do the pencil or the gel crayon first and then the water. So here's our watercolor paint and gel crayon. And then next we have the markers and the watercolor pencils. Now that I've got my artistic puddle, I do notice that of course all that water has made the paper a little bit wavy. So you can put this under a heavy book or run it through a die cut machine with no dye, or if it really bothers you, you can iron if the paper is too wavy. You want to put a little piece of paper towel over top if you do that to not pick up any color on your iron. But I find that when I glue it to the card base, that usually takes care of any waviness. So now I'm going to stamp, and I'm just using regular dye ink. Since I'm done applying water to the project, the dye ink is going to work just fine. And I don't need to press particularly hard, but you do need a second for the ink and the paper to accomplish the transfer. So don't be too quick to just slap the stamp down and then take it away. And so I'm putting down my sentiment and my image, and I'm going to do that on all 4 of my watercolor pieces here. And I think that looks very nice. Then I'm going to take these, trim them down just a little bit, and apply them to the card bases. And then here are the finished cards. I think that looks artistic, and it was really quick. For the next one, we do need a special type of ink. We need hybrid ink or pigment ink that will not be dissolved by water. You can, of course, use dye ink when you're watercoloring to get a no-line look, but I think that takes a little bit more effort, and I am a crafter in a hurry. So I'm going to stamp down my image and my sentiment with my hybrid ink. I did that 4 times for my 4 different products. And we're going to start with the watercolor paint. Now this did take a little bit longer. The watercolor puddles just took about 2 minutes per product. The paint took about the flowers took about 7 minutes per product. So I am putting down some clear water and then applying the paint. You could apply the paint to dry paper, but I find it blends better if the paper is a little bit damp before you get started. And the blendability is what I really like about water-based products. I have seen people do some really amazing things with alcohol markers. I just do not have that kind of time or that kind of patience. I love the blendability of water mediums. It's so easy. The water is right there doing all the work for you, so I don't need to worry about blending dark to light and light to dark, and I just don't have that kind of time. So I'm just applying several different colors of paint onto my little flower here, and I think it gives me a lovely blend of colors. I just think that turns out great. I am going to speed it along for the rest of the flowers, but the concept of this is the same. I'm using similar colors of pink and yellow on all of my flowers and just blending that out with a little bit of plain water. These paints are nothing special. I believe they're Artist Loft brand. I'll link all the products below. But any type of watercolor paint is going to work in a very similar way. The nicer paints may have a higher content of glycerin. They may be more light fast, but for these card projects I think the really inexpensive paint is just fine. So now we're going to move on to the markers. So I've got my little piece of wax paper there to scribble down the markers. My markers are Arteza markers, so they're kind of mid-range markers, but I think Crayola markers or any type of water-based marker is going to work just as well. Or like I said, if you have dye ink pads, you can smush down an ink pad and it's going to be very similar as well. So I'm scribbling down the markers onto the wax paper, and then I'm going to loosen up the ink on the wax paper with a little bit of a spray of water. I've already got my flower damp and ready to go, and I'm going to pick up that pigment with my brush and put it down onto my stamped flower where that hybrid ink is not dissolving because it is water resistant. And I can make an easy blend of pink and yellow on this flower because I've got that little puddle of water that's helping me to do the work. Now, of course, with a marker, you can just color directly onto the dry paper. It doesn't really work to moisten first, but I think what you'll find is that the marker is going to leave a little bit of a line. Once you've got the marker down on the paper, it's kind of hard to dissolve that so that you never see the line. I understand this works better on Bristol. I've heard that a lot. It has not been my experience. There's nothing wrong with a little bit of a line on your flower. It's just a slightly different look, so I just wanted you to be aware that that's one of the things that can happen when you're working directly on dry paper. Now that I've got the marker blended with a little bit of water, I can apply that directly to dry paper and it still blends beautifully. So I'm getting a nice blend of pink and yellow, and we will speed through the next couple of flowers. I think that turned out quite nicely. I think the markers were almost better than the watercolor paint. I'm not sure if that's the brands that I'm using or just how it worked out, but I thought the markers worked out really well. Now once we finish with the markers, we'll set that aside to dry and we'll turn to gel crayons. The gel crayons, you could scribble down onto wax paper or something and then pick up with water, but I like to apply them directly to the paper. It's going to be difficult to apply this to damp paper, of course. So gel crayons, though, as I mentioned, do dry out. So I don't think you want to color all 4 flowers and then run the water over them. I think you want to do them one at a time. And as well, this is a product that will dry out in storage. So if you're going to store gel crayons for a period of time, I would certainly suggest that you put those into a Ziploc bag or some type of airtight storage, because they will dry out and just be ruined. This is not something you want to set aside and come back to after a couple of years. So I hate to waste money. I want to get my crafty enjoyment out of my craft supplies. So just want to warn you about the gel crayons that they're not forever. Now, of course, you do want the product to dry because you don't want it to smear off of your project, but you don't want it to dry up in the stick before you've had a chance to use it. So the gel crayons do blend out pretty nicely, even applied on the dry paper, when I'm using them while they're still a little bit damp. The colors are not very subtle in this generic kit, but I've certainly got my money's worth out of it, so I've enjoyed it. Now we're going to move on to the last product, which is watercolor pencils. And of course, watercolor pencils, you can do all of your coloring and apply the water much later. These watercolor pencils are, I would say, nicer than some of the watercolor pencils I've used from other brands. They are highly pigmented, but there are some limitations to the product. You're always going to be able to see, I think, where the pencil was laid down onto the page. It never completely dissolves. These dissolve better than some of the less expensive ones that I've used, but it's not perfect. And I think you just have to work within the confines of your product. It's a little bit like me wanting to have my sister's curly hair. All the permanent waves and hot rollers in the world are not going to make me have curly hair, and vice versa. All the flat irons in the world are not going to give her perfectly straight hair. You just have to work with what you got. You can change it, but only so much. So again, I'm just using a blend of colors because I think the blendability is the part that I love most about water-based medium. And coloring the petals, leaving a little bit of white space because the blended out pencil is going to fill in that white space for me. I don't have to color every inch of every flower. And this is, I think, quicker than some methods of watercolor because you've got a lot of control and you're, I think, less hesitant, or I am. Maybe I shouldn't project onto you. Maybe you're the world's most confident watercolorist. But I do like these watercolor pencils, and I did enjoy using them for this project. Now, once all of the flowers are completely dry, absolutely dry, I am going to go back and fill in the centers. For the centers, I thought it would be fun to use a little bit of metallic watercolor. Now, for the metallic watercolor, I have only found this in the form of paint. There are quite a few different brands. I'll link to the one that I'm using below if you're interested in that. They were quite inexpensive. You can also use something like Perfect Pearls, or you can use a metallic marker. I think that would work equally well. But I have these little metallic watercolors, and so that's what I used on my watercolor flowers. So I'm just using the plain water to blend out my watercolor pencil. And now that we're done with that, we are going to go on to the centers. So I'm picking up that little bit of metallic watercolor to fill in the center of each flower. And then I'm going to color the little dots on the picture that represent the stamen. I think stamen is the right word. It's been quite some time since I took a biology class. So I thought that added a fun, shiny element to the card. And once all of these centers are painted and completely dry, I'm going to trim these down and put them onto the card fronts. And I thought that this was a good way to use up some watercolor products, and I hope that you will get out the products that you have and use them. This is watercolor paint and markers, and then we have got the gel crayons and the watercolor pencil. And now we're going to take a look at the finished cards. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I thank you for joining me.